Sometimes a man's greatest test isn't facing death. It's choosing to save lives when everything tells him to walk away. In a world where survival meant trusting no one, mountain man Silas McGraw made a choice that would haunt him forever. It was 1847 in the Colorado Territory. A blizzard was tearing through the mountains when Silas found 9 Apache women freezing to death outside his cabin. Any smart man would have kept walking. Any safe man would have looked the other way. But Silas brought them inside. By morning, 100 Apache warriors surrounded his home. These weren't random women caught in a storm. They were the wives and daughters of Apache chiefs, and they had been running from something far worse than winter weather. Now Silas was trapped between the storm outside and the fury of 100 warriors. One wrong move would mean death for everyone, but what would you do when showing mercy might cost you everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been whispering warnings all morning, but Silas McGraw had lived in these mountains long enough to know the difference between nature's gentle conversation and her angry threats. Today, she was building toward a fury that would test every living thing on the high ridges of the Colorado Territory. He stood on the narrow porch of his cabin, a structure he'd built with his own hands from the pine and aspen that surrounded him like old friends. The wood had weathered to a silver gray that matched the storm clouds gathering above the peaks. At 45, Silas carried himself with the careful economy of movement that came from 15 years of mountain living, where every step might be your last if you weren't paying attention. His neighbors called him Grizzly McGraw, though the nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride through terrain that could break a horse's leg or a man's neck without much trouble. The nickname had stuck after he'd killed a 9-foot brown bear with nothing but a knife, and the kind of desperate courage that comes when there's nowhere left to run. But those who knew him best understood that the bear hadn't been the real reason for the name. It was the way he carried himself. Powerful, solitary, dangerous when cornered, but fundamentally peaceful unless provoked. The cabin sat in a natural clearing about 8,000 feet up, protected on 3 sides by granite, walls that rose like cathedral spires into the thin mountain air. A creek ran year-round, just 50 yards from his door, fed by springs that never froze completely, even in the depths of winter. Silas had chosen this spot not just for its defensibility, old habits from his army days, but for its beauty. From his porch, he could see down the valley for miles, watching the seasons change the landscape like pages, turning in God's own book. Inside the cabin, everything had its place and served its purpose. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, built to throw heat efficiently into every corner during the brutal mountain winters. Hand-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a bed frame, spoke to countless evenings when the only sounds were the settling of logs and the scratch of his carving knife against wood. Shelves lined the walls, holding books he'd read so many times the spines had worn smooth, alongside jars of preserved food, ammunition, and the tools that kept him alive in this unforgiving place. On the mantel above the fireplace sat his most prized possession, a small wooden bear he'd carved from a piece of pine struck by lightning. It wasn't much to look at, crude really, compared to the intricate work done by craftsmen in the settlements, but it represented something important to him. The bear embodied his philosophy of living in harmony with the wilderness rather than fighting it, of taking only what he needed and respecting the natural order that had existed here long before white men arrived with their hunger for gold and land. Silas had come to these mountains in 1832, a young man running from memories that still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. He'd served as a scout for the army, learning to track and survive in country that killed unprepared men as easily as winter killed flowers. But he'd seen too much of what civilization brought to the frontier, too much greed disguised as progress, too much violence justified as necessity. The final straw had been a massacre he'd been ordered to guide soldiers to, a peaceful Cheyenne village that posed no threat to anyone. He'd done his duty, led them there, and watched as people who'd shown him nothing but kindness were cut down like wheat before the scythe. After that, he turned in his uniform and headed for the high country, looking for a place where a man's worth was measured by his ability to live with honor rather than his willingness to follow orders that kept him awake at night. The mountains had welcomed him, taught him their rhythms and their rules. He learned which plants could heal and which could kill, how to read weather in the behavior of animals, how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. More importantly, he learned to be alone with himself and find peace in the silence. But isolation had never meant hatred of other people. During his army years, Silas had worked alongside Apache scouts, men who knew the land in ways that humbled him even now. He'd learned enough of their language to conduct basic conversations, and more importantly, he'd learned to respect their deep understanding of the balance between taking and giving back. They'd taught him that survival wasn't about conquering the wilderness, it was about becoming part of it. Over the years, he'd had occasional visitors, trappers heading to or from the trading posts, prospectors chasing rumors of gold, even a few Apache hunters who'd recognized him from the old days and stopped to share a meal and catch up on news from the world below. These encounters had been generally friendly, marked by the mutual respect that existed between people who understood what it meant to live on the edge of survival. Silas had a reputation among the native peoples as a man who kept his word and treated others as he wished to be treated, a rarity in a territory where trust was often the first casualty of cultural collision. His daily routine had settled into a comfortable pattern over the years. Up before dawn to check his traps and tend to his small garden during the growing season. Mornings were for hunting or fishing, afternoons for the endless tasks of maintenance that kept his cabin habitable and his equipment functional. Evenings belonged to reading, carving, or simply sitting on his porch and watching the stars emerge in the thin mountain air. It was a simple life, but it suited him. He'd found something in these peaks that he'd never experienced in the settlements. Below, a sense of belonging that didn't depend on other people's approval or society's rules. The weather had been unusually mild for late October, with warm days that made the aspen leaves glow like coins in the afternoon sun. But Silas had noticed signs that experienced mountain men learned to read like scripture. The birds were acting restless, gathering in larger flocks than normal and moving to lower elevations. The squirrels and chipmunks were working with unusual urgency, storing food as if they knew something was coming. Most telling of all, the wind patterns had shifted, bringing air that carried the smell of snow from high peaks that stayed white year-round. Now, standing on his porch in the early afternoon, Silas could feel the barometric pressure dropping like a stone. The temperature had fallen 15 degrees in the past hour, and the wind was picking up, whistling through the pine boughs with a voice that spoke of serious weather ahead. This wasn't going to be one of the gentle snows that dusted the peaks and melted by noon. This had the feel of a storm that would reshape the landscape, the kind that separated the prepared from the careless. He spent the rest of the afternoon making ready. Extra firewood stacked on the porch, where he could reach it, even if snow piled deep against the walls. Water containers filled from the creek before it became too dangerous to venture outside. His rifle cleaned and loaded, not because he expected trouble, but because preparedness was a habit that had kept him alive for 15 years. Food supplies checked and arranged for easy access during what might be several days of confinement. As darkness approached, the first snowflakes began to fall, big, wet flakes that melted when they hit the ground but promised to keep coming. Long after the earth grew too cold to accept them, Silas stood in his doorway, breathing in the sharp, clean smell that came before a serious snowfall. In town, people would be hurrying to finish their business and get home to warm fires. Up here, he was already home, and the approaching storm felt less like a threat than like an old friend coming to visit. He had no way of knowing that before this storm passed, his solitary life would be changed forever. No way of knowing that. 9 desperate people were struggling through the gathering darkness, fighting for survival in conditions that killed the unprepared with ruthless efficiency. No way of knowing that his next decision would set in motion events that would test everything he believed about honor, courage, and the bonds that connect all living things. For now, there was only the peace of evening settling over his mountain. Sanctuary, the promise of snow in the air, and the comfortable weight of solitude that had been his companion for so many years. Tomorrow would bring what tomorrow would bring. Tonight, Silas McGraw was simply a man grateful for his warm cabin, and the simple blessing of being exactly where he belonged. The storm arrived like a living thing with teeth and claws, transforming the peaceful mountain evening into a howling wilderness that seemed bent on erasing every trace of human presence from the high country. By midnight, the wind was driving snow horizontally across the clearing, creating drifts that reshaped themselves with each gust. Silas had seen blizzards before, but this one carried a malevolence that made him grateful for the thick log walls and the steady heat radiating from his fireplace. He'd given up trying to sleep around 2 in the morning. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of wind that must have been gusting to 60 miles per hour. And the temperature had dropped so fast that frost was forming on the inside of his windows despite the roaring fire. This was the kind of storm that killed travelers, the kind that left frozen bodies to be discovered when the snow melted in spring, if they were discovered at all. The sound came just after 3 o'clock, so faint he almost missed it beneath. The wind's constant shriek, a rhythmic thumping too regular to be a branch beating against the cabin wall. Silas sat up in his chair, where he'd been dozing with his rifle across his knees, and listened intently. There it was again, deliberate, desperate, the sound of someone pounding on his door. No rational person would be out in weather like this. It had to be someone in serious trouble, probably lost and facing death from exposure. Silas moved to the door, but didn't open it immediately. 15 years of mountain living had taught him caution, even when his instincts urged compassion. "Who's out there?" he called through the thick wood. The answer came in a voice so weak he could barely hear it over the storm. A woman's voice, speaking words he recognized as Apache, though his grasp of the language was far from perfect. She was asking for help, begging for shelter, and there were others with her. Silas unbarred the door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance. The scene that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. 9 women, all Apache, by their dress and features, huddled together in the small shelter of his porch overhang. They were beyond exhaustion, beyond cold. They were dying by degrees, their faces grey with hypothermia, their clothing inadequate for the killing weather. Several were supporting others who could barely stand. The woman who had spoken, elderly, with silver-streaked hair escaping from beneath a torn shawl, met his eyes with a look that combined desperate hope with the resigned dignity of someone who had already accepted death. Behind her, the others stood in various stages of collapse, some bleeding from cuts and scratches, all of them shivering so violently they could barely maintain their footing. Silas didn't hesitate. "Come in quickly," he said in his rough Apache, gesturing urgently toward the warmth inside. The women stumbled through the doorway like refugees from hell itself, bringing with them the smell of snow and fear and something else, something metallic that he recognized as dried blood. Once inside, with the door barred again against the storm, Silas could see the full extent of their ordeal. These weren't women who had simply been caught unprepared by the weather. Their clothes were torn, their faces and hands cut, as if they'd been running through thorns or rocky terrain in darkness. Most telling of all, their moccasins were worn through, leaving bloody footprints on his clean wooden floor. The eldest woman, the one who had spoken, seemed to be the leader of the group. Despite her exhaustion, she maintained a bearing that spoke of authority, of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. When she tried to speak, thanking him in halting Apache mixed with a few English words, Silas could see that she was fighting to stay conscious. "Rest first," he told her, in his limited Apache, guiding her to one of his chairs near the fire. "Talk later, warm first." For the next hour, Silas worked with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that lives hung in the balance. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost stifling, knowing that hypothermia killed more surely than any bullet. He heated water and prepared warm drinks, mixing honey with weak tea to get calories into bodies that were consuming themselves to stay alive. He brought out every blanket he owned, every piece of warm clothing he could spare. The women accepted his help with the wariness of wild creatures who had learned not to trust, but their desperate need for warmth overcame their caution. Gradually, color began to return to faces that had been gray with approaching death. The violent shivering subsided as their core temperatures slowly climbed back toward safety. As they recovered enough to speak, Silas began to piece together fragments of their story. They spoke in rapid Apache among themselves, occasionally throwing glances his way that were hard to read. The elderly woman, who had introduced herself as Ayana, seemed to be debating something with the others, weighing risks that Silas could only guess at. Finally, as dawn approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, Ayana spoke to him directly. Her English was limited but understandable, learned from traders and missionaries over the years. "Bad soldiers," she said, her voice carrying a weight of pain that went far beyond physical exhaustion. "They come to our camp. We run." She pointed to a tear in her shawl, and Silas could see that it was stained with blood, not her own from the look of it. Then she reached into her clothing and pulled out something that made his blood run cold. A brass military button, the kind worn by U.S. cavalry officers. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These women weren't just travelers caught in a storm. They were refugees, fleeing from violence perpetrated by soldiers who wore the same uniform he had once worn with pride. The button was evidence of something that made his stomach turn. Soldiers. Attacking civilians, men who had sworn to protect the innocent turning predator instead. How many? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ayana held up both hands, then 3 more fingers. 13 soldiers, armed and mounted, attacking what must have been a peaceful camp. The women had run into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs, fleeing into a storm that should have killed them rather than face whatever. Those soldiers had planned. As the night wore on and his guests fell into exhausted sleep around his fire, Silas found himself wrestling with emotions he thought he'd buried 15 years ago. The anger he'd felt at frontier injustices, the shame of being associated with men who brought dishonor to the uniform, the helpless rage at a system that seemed designed to crush the weak under the boots of the strong. But there was something else, something that worried him more than his own complicated feelings. If these women had fled from soldiers, those soldiers would be looking for them, and when the storm passed, they might well follow the trail that led straight to his door. He looked around his cabin at the sleeping women, at people who had trusted him with their lives based on nothing more than his willingness to open his door in their darkest hour. They were safe for now, but what would morning bring? What would he do if soldiers came looking for them? What would they do if they discovered he had given shelter to the people they were hunting? Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. Silas McGraw had spent 15 years avoiding the complications that came with human connections, choosing the clean simplicity of solitude over the messy moral compromises that seemed inevitable when people's lives became entangled. Now, watching over 9 strangers who had appeared out of the night like ghosts made flesh, he realized that his days of peaceful isolation were over. Whether he liked it or not, he was now part of something larger than himself, something that would demand more courage than simply surviving alone in the wilderness. The brass button lay on his table like an accusation, catching the firelight and throwing it back in tiny, angry sparks. By morning, he would have to decide what kind of man he truly was, the kind who minded his own business and avoided trouble, or the kind who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. Dawn was still hours away, but Silas could already feel the weight of the choice that would define the rest of his life. Dawn came like a blade of silver light, cutting through the storm clouds, revealing a world transformed. The blizzard had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline landscape that sparkled under the emerging sun. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the clearing, with drifts piled against the cabin walls that reached nearly to the windows. It was beautiful and deadly, the kind of morning that could fool a man into thinking winter was gentle right up until the cold killed him. Silas had been awake for an hour, moving quietly around his cabin so as not to wake his guests. The 9 Apache women lay sleeping in various positions around the fireplace, wrapped in his blankets and spare clothes, looking far more peaceful than they had any right to after what they'd endured. But even in sleep, their faces carried the tension of people who had learned not to trust in safety. He was checking his rifle when the sound reached him, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of many horses moving through snow. Silas froze, listening intently. The hoofbeats were coming from the south, following the same general route the women must have taken. It could be travelers, trappers, or traders, but his gut told him otherwise. This had the sound of purpose, of men who knew exactly where they were going. Moving to the window, Silas peered through the frost-covered glass and felt his blood turn to ice water. Riders were emerging from the tree line at the far end of his clearing. Not the 13 soldiers Ayanna had described, but what looked like 100 mounted Apache warriors spread out in a rough semicircle that was slowly tightening around his cabin. They moved with the fluid precision of men who had been born on horseback, their ponies picking their way through the deep snow. With practiced ease, most carried traditional weapons, bows, lances, war clubs, but Silas could see rifles among them as well. They wore war paint and battle dress, and even at this distance he could read the grim purpose in their posture. Behind him, one of the women stirred and sat up, immediately alert in the way of people accustomed to danger. It was Ayanna, her silver hair catching the morning light as she took in his tense stance at the window. She spoke quietly to the others in Apache, and within moments all 9 were awake and moving with the quick efficiency of those who knew that survival often depended on being ready to run at a moment's notice. "Warriors," Silas said simply, not turning from the window. "Many of them." Ayanna moved to join him at the window, her face grave as she took in the sight of the approaching riders. She spoke in rapid Apache to the other women, and Silas caught enough words to understand that these were their people, fathers, brothers, husbands, who had come looking for them. "They think you take us," Ayanna said quietly, her English careful but clear. "They not know you help." Silas nodded grimly. From the warriors' perspective, this would look exactly like what they most feared. Their women held captive by a white man in an isolated cabin. The fact that he had actually saved their lives would be difficult to explain, especially when emotions were running high and the language barrier made communication challenging. "I go out," he said, checking that his rifle was loaded, but keeping it pointed toward the floor. "You stay inside." Ayanna caught his arm with surprising strength. "They kill you if you go alone. Take me. I tell them truth. Too dangerous. If shooting starts, we all die anyway," she interrupted, with the practical wisdom of someone who had survived decades in a harsh world. "Better to try talking first." Silas looked into her eyes and saw the same courage that had kept her alive through the night's ordeal. She was right, of course. His only chance of avoiding bloodshed was to have someone who could explain what had really happened, someone the warriors would trust. Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit like a physical blow after the warmth of the cabin, and the snow crunched under their feet with the sound of breaking glass. The warriors had stopped their advance about 50 yards away, close enough for effective shooting, but far enough to give themselves room to maneuver if trouble started. One of them rode forward, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His horse was a magnificent paint stallion that moved through the snow as if it were dancing, and the warrior himself sat his mount with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. War paint decorated his face in patterns that Silas didn't recognize, and his dark eyes held the kind of controlled fury that could explode into violence without warning. The warrior spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. Though Silas couldn't understand all the words, the tone was unmistakable. Accusation, demand, barely controlled rage. This was a man who had ridden through the night expecting to find his people in captivity or worse, and the sight of them emerging from a white man's cabin was not reassuring him. Ayanna replied in the same language, her voice calm but urgent. Silas caught fragments, words for help, storm, soldiers, saved us. She gestured toward him and then toward the brass button, which she had brought outside as evidence of what they had fled from. The warrior's expression didn't change, but his hand moved away from the war club at his belt. He barked something to the other riders, and several of them dismounted, moving forward with weapons ready but not immediately threatening. These were scouts, Silas realized, men sent to verify Ayanna's story and assess the situation before deciding whether to fight or talk. One of the scouts approached the cabin and bent to examine the tracks in the snow around the door. The story written there was clear enough, multiple sets of footprints belonging to women, all leading to the cabin from the direction of the wilderness. No signs of struggle, no evidence of force or captivity. Another scout examined the women's torn clothing and worn moccasins, seeing the evidence of their desperate flight through the storm. The blood on their feet and hands told a story of people who had run for their lives, not people who had been captured and transported. The war chief, for that's clearly what he was, listened to his scouts' reports with the patience of a man, accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. When they finished, he turned his attention back to Silas, studying the mountain man with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Finally, the chief spoke directly to Silas. In heavily accented but understandable English, "You are the one they call Grizzly McGraw." It wasn't a question. Silas nodded, wondering how his reputation had spread far enough to reach Apache camps. "My name is Nalnish. 2 of these women are my daughters." The chief's voice carried the weight of barely controlled emotion. "If you have harmed them, I haven't," Silas interrupted, his own voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "They came to my door dying from the cold. I gave them shelter, nothing more." For a long moment the 2 men stared at each other across the snow-covered clearing, warrior and mountain man, each taking the measure of the other. Around them, 800 Apache fighters waited for a word from their chief, ready to turn this peaceful morning into a bloodbath at the slightest provocation. The brass button glinted in Ayanna's hand, a small piece of metal that represented so much more than its size suggested betrayal, violence, the corruption of men who wore the uniform Silas had once worn with pride. Whatever happened next would depend on whether a Apache war chief could trust the word of a white mountain man, and whether that mountain man could find the words to bridge a gap that had been carved by generations of mistrust and violence. The beast's silence stretched like a bowstring, pulled to its breaking point. War Chief Nalnish sat motionless on his paint stallion, his dark eyes moving between Silas and the brass button in Ayanna's weathered hand. Around the clearing, 100 Apache warriors waited with the patience of men who understood that some decisions could not be rushed, even when lives hung in the balance. Ayanna stepped forward, holding the button where Nalnish could see it. Clearly, when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of an elder speaking truth to power. Silas caught enough of her Apache to understand that she was telling the story of the attack, describing how soldiers had come to their camp like wolves in the night, how the women had fled into the storm rather than face whatever those men had planned for them. As she spoke, one of the other women, younger, with Nalnish's distinctive cheekbones and the bearing of someone born to leadership, moved to stand beside Ayana. This had to be one of the chief's daughters, and when she began to speak, her father's expression shifted from controlled fury to something deeper and more dangerous. The daughter rolled up her sleeve, revealing bruises that were clearly the marks of rough hands. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear, and Silas didn't need a translation to understand what she was describing. The soldiers hadn't just attacked the camp, they had tried to take the women. For their own purposes. Nalnish's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cords beneath his war paint. When his daughter finished speaking, he turned his attention back to Silas, but now his gaze held a different quality. Not the suspicion of an enemy, but the assessment of a potential ally. The soldiers who did this, the war chief said in his careful English, they wore the blue coats of the U.S. Army. Silas nodded grimly. The button says cavalry. But not all soldiers are like these men, Chief Nalnish. There are good men who wear the uniform with honor. And there are snakes who crawl in the skin of men, Nalnish replied, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. Tell me, Grizzly McGraw, do you know these snake soldiers? The question hit Silas like a physical blow. The honest answer was that he might well know them, or at least know of them. His years as an Army scout had introduced him to most of the officers serving in the Colorado Territory, and the reputation of units known for their brutality spread quickly through military circles. Good officers avoided associating with such men, but they knew who they were. I might, Silas admitted, if you can tell me more about them. How many, what they looked like, which direction they came from. Ayana translated the question to the women, and gradually a clearer picture emerged. 13 soldiers led by an officer with a scarred face and graying hair. They had ridden from the southeast, following what appeared to be a planned route rather than a random patrol. Most disturbing of all, they had carried shackles and rope, suggesting that taking captives had been their primary objective rather than a crime of opportunity. The description sent a chill down Silas's spine. He knew of only one cavalry unit operating in that area with a reputation for the kind of behavior being described. And if his suspicions were correct, these women had been incredibly lucky to escape. The unit in question was led by a man who had been cashiered from regular service for excessive brutality, but had somehow managed to secure a position leading what was euphemistically called a special patrol. Soldiers given broad authority to operate independently in areas where regular military oversight was limited. I think I know who they are, Silas said finally. If I'm right, these women were in more danger than just being captured. The man who leads that unit, he has a reputation for things that would make decent people sick. Nalnish nodded grimly. This explains why they ran into the storm. Better to die clean than live with shame. The war chief dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his warriors remaining alert but lowering their weapons slightly. This was a sign of trust, Silas realized. A powerful leader making himself vulnerable to demonstrate his willingness to listen rather than fight. Up close, Nalnish was an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the scars that marked a lifetime of warfare. But his eyes held intelligence as well as strength, the look of a man who understood that survival often depended more on wisdom than on violence. You served with the army, Nalnish said. It wasn't a question. Years ago. I was a scout before. I came to the mountains. Why did you leave their service? The question went to the heart of everything Silas had been running from for 15 years. He could have given a simple answer. Something about preferring the freedom of mountain life to military discipline. But something in Nalnish's eyes demanded honesty, the kind of truth that could form the foundation of trust between men who had every reason to be enemies. Because I saw good men ordered to do evil things, Silas said quietly. Because I guided soldiers to a peaceful Cheyenne village and watched them kill people who had never harmed anyone, because wearing the uniform stopped meaning honor and started meaning shame. The words hung in the cold mountain air like smoke from a fire, visible and substantial. Nalnish studied Silas's face for a long moment, reading the pain that still lived there after all these years. "That is why you live alone in these mountains," the war chief said with understanding. "You seek to wash the blood from your hands." "I seek to make sure I never have blood on my hands again," Silas corrected. "But sometimes a man doesn't get to choose his battles." Around them, the tension was slowly draining from the confrontation, as word spread among the warriors that their women were safe and had been treated with respect. Several of the younger fighters had dismounted and were embracing their wives and daughters, their relief evident in voices that shook with emotion. But Nalnish remained focused on the larger problem. "The snake soldiers will come looking for these women. They will follow the trail to your cabin." "Probably," Silas agreed. "The question is what we do when they arrive." "We?" The war chief raised an eyebrow. "I opened my door to your people when they needed help. That makes their enemies my enemies, whether I like it or not." For the first time since his arrival, Nalnish smiled, a brief expression that transformed his painted features from intimidating to almost paternal. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Grizzly McGraw. In my experience, there's not much difference between the two." The war chief's smile widened slightly. "Perhaps that is why they call you Grizzly. The bear is both brave and foolish, and sometimes that is exactly what the world needs." From the cabin porch, Ayana called out in Apache, holding up something. She had found among the torn clothing of one of the women. It was small and silver, catching the morning sunlight, a broken chain that had once held a cross. The religious symbol had been torn away, leaving only the delicate links that spoke of faith tested by violence. Nalnish took the chain gently, his expression darkening as he examined it. "This belonged to my youngest daughter. It was a gift from the mission priest, a symbol of the peace she hoped could exist between our peoples." He looked up at Silas, and in his eyes was a pain that went deeper than anger. "These soldiers, they do not just attack our bodies. They attack our hope." Silas felt something shift inside him, an awakening of purpose he hadn't experienced since his army days. But this time, the cause was clear and just, protecting the innocent from predators who wore uniforms as a disguise for their cruelty. "Then maybe it's time to give your daughter's hope some teeth," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to show these soldiers that some people won't be intimidated." The war chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, I think perhaps it is." The storm clouds were building again by afternoon, though this time they promised snow rather than the violent blizzard that had driven the Apache women to Silas's door. Inside the cabin, an unlikely council of war was taking shape around the rough-hewn table, where Silas had shared so many solitary meals over the years. Nalnish sat across from him, his war paint now supplemented by the practical clothes Silas had offered. A wool shirt and heavy coat that would keep him warm during the long night ahead. 3 of his senior warriors had joined them, men whose names Silas was learning slowly. Bidzeel, a graying veteran with intelligent eyes and scars that spoke of many battles. Young Bear, whose name belied his actual age of perhaps 35, and whose hot temper was barely held in check by respect for his chief. And Hasteen, a quiet man who seemed to see everything and speak only when his words would matter. The women had withdrawn to the far side of the cabin, but Silas could feel their attention on the conversation. Ayana, in particular, watched everything, with the sharp awareness of someone who understood that decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether her people lived or died. "Tell us about these soldiers," Nalnish said, his English careful but clear. "You said you might know them." Silas reached into a wooden box beneath his table and withdrew something he hadn't looked at in years, a faded photograph that had once meant the world to him. It showed a young woman with kind eyes holding a small boy, both of them smiling at something beyond the camera's view. His wife and son, killed in a senseless raid while he was away on army business, their deaths part of the endless cycle of violence that seemed to define frontier life. "This is why I left the army," he said quietly, showing the photograph to Nilnish. "My family was killed by men who thought that wearing a uniform gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. The soldiers who attacked your camp, they're cut from the same cloth." The war chief studied the photograph with the respectful attention he would give to a sacred object. "You have walked the same path of loss as my people. This explains much." Silas put the photograph away and turned his attention to the map he had spread on the table, a hand-drawn chart of the local territory that he had created over years of exploration. "The unit you're dealing with is probably commanded by a man named Colonel Marcus Marwick. He was cashiered from regular service 5 years ago for what the army called excessive methods, but somehow he managed to get himself appointed to lead a special patrol with broad authority to operate independently." Young Bear leaned forward, his eyes burning with anger. "This Marwick, he is the scarred one who led the attack?" "If the description matches, yes. Scar runs from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Got it from a Sioux warrior who almost took his head off before dying." Marwick likes to tell that story. He thinks it makes him sound dangerous instead of just lucky. Bidzil spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "What kind of man leads such soldiers?" Silas considered his words carefully. These men deserved the truth, but the truth was ugly enough to make strong. Stomachs turn. The kind who uses his authority to indulge appetites that would get him hanged in civilized places. He recruits men who are running from something, debts, crimes, shame, and gives them license to do things that regular soldiers would refuse. They're not really army anymore, just bandits with uniforms. The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the pine boughs outside. Finally, Hastian spoke, his quiet voice somehow carrying more weight than if he had shouted. "How many of these bandits does he command?" "Last I heard, maybe 20 men. Total, but they're well armed, and they have the advantage of being able to claim official sanction for whatever they do. Local authorities won't move against them without clear proof of wrongdoing, and they're careful not to leave witnesses." "Except this time they did," Nalnish said grimly. 9 witnesses who can testify to what they attempted. Silas nodded, but his expression remained troubled, "Which is why they'll come looking. They can't afford to let your women reach anyone who might listen to their story. Marwick knows that if word gets back to territorial headquarters about what his unit is really doing, he'll face a court-martial at best, and a noose at worst." Young Bear's hand moved unconsciously to his tomahawk. "Let them come. We have 100 warriors. In open country, yes, you'd have the advantage," Silas agreed. "But they won't fight fair. They'll try to use the women as leverage, threaten to harm them unless you surrender. Or they might wait for you to leave and then attack when only a few guards remain. Marwick didn't survive this long by being honorable." The war chief studied the map, his finger tracing the various routes that led to Silas's clearing. "You know this land better than any of us. What would you do in his place?" Silas had been thinking about that question for hours, putting himself in the mind of a man he despised but had learned to understand during their brief encounters years ago. Marwick was cunning in the way of a predator, always looking for the path of least resistance and greatest advantage. He'll send scouts first, probably 2 or 3 men, to confirm that the women are here and assess your strength. When they report back about the war party, he'll have to decide whether the risk is worth the potential reward. If he's smart, he'll withdraw and look for easier prey. And if he's not smart, Bidzil asked, then he'll try to find a way to use superior firepower and tactics to overcome your numbers. His men have repeating rifles and experience fighting. Apache. They'll try to turn this into the kind of battle where their advantages matter most. Ayana spoke from across the cabin, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. Though she spoke in Apache, Silas caught enough words to understand that she was reminding them of something important, the children and elders back at the main camp, who would be defenseless if all the warriors were drawn into a battle here. Nalnish nodded gravely at her words, then turned back to Silas. My grandmother reminds us that protecting these 9 women means nothing if we lose the rest of our people. We cannot all stay here indefinitely. It was the central dilemma of asymmetric warfare, one that Silas had grappled with during his army days. How do you protect the innocent when the enemy is willing to target them specifically? How do you fight honorably against men who recognize no rules beyond their own advantage? There might be another way, Silas said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Instead of waiting for Marwick to make the first move, we could force his hand, make him come to us on our terms rather than his. Speak plainly, Young Bear demanded. Silas looked around the cabin at the faces watching him, warriors who had trusted him enough to enter his home, women who had placed their lives in his hands, people who represented the best of 2 cultures that had been taught to see each other as enemies. We use me as bait, he said quietly. I ride out alone, make contact with Marwick's scouts, and tell them I'm willing to negotiate. I convince them that I'm just a mountain man who doesn't want trouble, willing to trade information about your location for safe passage out of the B territory. The cabin erupted in protests, voices raised in both Apache and English as everyone tried to speak at once. But Nalnish raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. That would be suicide, the war chief said simply. Not if we do it right. Marwick will want to meet with me personally. His ego demands it. He'll want to humiliate the man who interfered with his plans, but he'll also be cautious, afraid of an ambush, so he'll choose the meeting place, somewhere he thinks gives him the advantage. Silas traced a circle on the map around a small valley, about 2 miles south of his cabin. There are only 3 places in this area where he'd feel safe enough to meet, places with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. If we can predict which one he'll choose, we can be ready for him. And then? Haston asked quietly. Then we turn his trap into ours, Silas replied. We give him exactly what he expects to see, one foolish mountain man walking into an obvious trap, right up until the moment we don't. The plan was audacious, risky, and dependent on Silas's ability to read the mind of a man he hadn't seen in years. But as he looked around the cabin at the people who had become his responsibility, he realized that it was also the only chance they had of ending this confrontation before it spiraled into the kind of bloodbath that would bring the full weight of territorial authority down on Nalnish's people. Outside, the first snowflakes of the new storm were beginning to fall, and somewhere in the growing darkness, Colonel Marcus Marwick was probably planning his own approach to the problem of 9 missing Apache women and the mountain man foolish enough to protect them. The second night brought an unexpected gift, not just the tactical advantage of time to plan, but something far more precious. The slow building of trust between people who had every reason to remain strangers. As the Apache warriors settled into defensive positions around Silas's cabin, the artificial barriers that separated mountain man from warrior began to dissolve in the shared warmth of firelight and common purpose. Silas found himself working alongside Bidzil to improve the cabin's defenses, and he was struck by the older warrior's tactical intelligence. The Apache veteran saw weaknesses in the cabin's positioning that Silas had never considered, blind spots that could be exploited by an attacking force, and he suggested modifications that were both practical and clever. You built this place. Thinking like a white man, Bidzil observed with gentle humor as they reinforced the shutters with additional wood. Always facing south for the sun, back to the mountain for protection. But Apache think like the deer. Many ways in, many ways out. Together, they created firing positions that could cover all approaches to the clearing, camouflaged several escape routes through the trees, and established signals that would allow the defenders to coordinate their movements without exposing themselves to enemy fire. It was practical work, but it was also something more. Two experienced fighters sharing knowledge across cultural lines, finding common ground in their mutual respect for tactical excellence. Inside the cabin, a different kind of alliance was forming. Ayana had taken it upon herself to tend to a minor wound that young Bear had suffered during the night ride through the storm, and Silas watched with fascination as she applied a poultice made from plants she had gathered even in the depths of winter. Her knowledge of healing was extensive, built on generations of accumulated wisdom that put most frontier medicine to shame. "Your people know things that mine have forgotten," Silas remarked as he watched her work. "All people know different. Pieces of the same truths," Ayana replied philosophically. "The wise ones learn from each other instead of fighting over who knows more." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Hastian, who had been scouting the southern approaches to the cabin. His news was both expected and troubling. Riders were moving through the lower valleys, too many to be casual travelers and too organized to be anything but military. 3 groups, Hastin reported to Nalnish in English for Silas's benefit. Maybe 6 men each, spread out like they're looking for something specific. They move carefully, like men who know they're in hostile country. Silas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced before every major engagement during his army days. The waiting was over. The enemy was finally making his move, but instead of the fear he might have expected, he felt something closer to relief. After years of running from his past, he was finally going to face it head-on. "How long before they reach us?" Nalnish asked. "If they maintain their current pace and don't stop to make camp, maybe 6 hours. But they're being cautious, checking every possible hiding place along the way. My guess is they'll arrive just after dawn." It was exactly what Silas had predicted. Marwick was too experienced to attack at night in unfamiliar territory, but he also wouldn't want to give his enemies time to prepare elaborate defenses. A dawn assault would give his men the advantage of surprise while providing enough light to coordinate their movements effectively. "That gives us time to put the plan into motion," Silas said, reaching for his heavy coat. "I need to get into position before his scouts reach the outer perimeter." Young Bear stood up abruptly, his face clouded with frustration. "This plan is madness. Why should we trust our lives to tricks and deception when we have the strength to fight them directly?" It was a fair question, and Silas could see that several of the other warriors shared Young Bear's doubts. The Apache were magnificent fighters, feared throughout the territory for their skill and courage in battle. The idea of avoiding a direct confrontation went against everything their warrior culture had taught them about honor and strength. Nalnish studied his subordinate with the patient expression of a leader who had dealt with similar objections many times before. "Because, my young friend, there is more at stake here than our pride. If we fight Marwick soldiers and win, we will be branded as murderers by the territorial government. They will send the real army after us, hundreds of soldiers who are not corrupt bandits but good men following orders. Our people will pay the price for our victory." "And if we lose?" Young Bear demanded. "If we lose fighting honorably, we die as warriors," Nalnish acknowledged. "But the women we are trying to protect will suffer fates worse than death, and our failure will encourage other predators to believe that Apache people are easy prey." The war chief stood and walked to where Silas was checking his rifle, placing a hand on the mountain man's shoulder with surprising gentleness. "But if Grizzly McGraw's plan succeeds, we eliminate the threat, without giving the government an excuse to destroy our people. We protect the innocent without becoming outlaws ourselves." Silas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. These people were trusting him with more than their lives. They were trusting him with their future, their children's future, their very survival as a people. It was a responsibility he had never asked for, but one he could not walk away from. "There's something else you need to know," he said quietly, making a decision that would either save them all or doom them. "The reason I'm so certain about how Marwick thinks, how he'll react to our moves, it's because I served under him years ago, before he went rogue." The confession hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications. Silas could see the Apache warriors processing this information, weighing what it meant about his loyalties and his motivations. "He was your commander?" Nalnish asked carefully. "For about 6 months early in my service, long enough to learn that he was a man who saw indigenous people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of respect. I requested a transfer after watching him execute prisoners who had surrendered under a flag of truce. The memory was still painful after all these years. The sight of unarmed Cheyenne warriors being shot down in cold blood while Marwick watched with satisfaction. It had been Silas's first real glimpse of the kind of evil that could hide behind the facade of military discipline and patriotic duty. "That's why you left the army," Ayana said with understanding. "Not just because of your family, but because you could not serve such men." "I stayed longer than I should have, telling myself that I could do more good from inside the system than outside it. But there comes a point where silence becomes complicity, where following orders becomes participation in murder." Young Bear's expression had softened somewhat, and when he spoke, his voice carried less anger and more thoughtful consideration. "So, when you face this Marwick tomorrow, you will be settling an old debt as well as protecting our women." "I'll be doing what I should have done 15 years ago," Silas confirmed. "I'll be standing up to a bully who thinks his uniform gives him the right to brutalize innocent people." The war chief picked up something from the table, a beautifully carved pipe that he had brought from his camp, its bowl decorated with symbols that told the story of his people's long struggle for survival. He packed it carefully with tobacco and lit it with a coal from the fire, taking a deep draw before passing it to Silas. "Among my people, when warriors share the pipe before battle, it means they trust each other with their lives," Nalnish explained. "It means they have put aside all differences and united for a common cause." Silas accepted the pipe with the solemnity the moment deserved, feeling the smoke fill his lungs with its earthy, sacred taste. When he passed it to Bidziel, he saw acceptance in the older warrior's eyes. When young Bear took his turn, the hot-tempered fighter nodded slightly, not quite friendship, but the beginning of respect. As the pipe made its way around the circle, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced since his family's death. The sense of belonging to something larger than himself, of being part of a brotherhood that transcended the artificial divisions of race and culture. These men had accepted him not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to stand with them when it mattered most. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, Colonel Marcus Marwick was making his final preparations for what he undoubtedly believed would be an easy victory. He had no way of knowing that the solitary mountain man he was hunting had found allies, or that his own past was riding toward him through the storm like justice on horseback. Dawn was still hours away, but Silas McGraw was already a different man than he had been when the storm first brought desperate strangers to his door. The third dawn brought visitors, but not the ones they had been expecting. Silas was preparing to ride out for his dangerous rendezvous with Marwick when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the snow-covered clearing. But instead of the coordinated movement of military units, these riders moved with the desperate urgency of men fleeing for their lives. 3 soldiers burst from the tree line, their uniforms torn and bloody, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. One of them was slumped forward in his saddle, clearly wounded, while the other 2 looked back over their shoulders as if expecting pursuit. These weren't the advanced scouts of Marwick's force. These were survivors of something that had gone very wrong. The Apache warriors reacted instantly, weapons raised and ready, but Nalnish held up a hand to prevent immediate violence. Something about the soldiers' condition suggested they posed no immediate threat, and the war chief's tactical mind was already working to understand what their arrival might mean. "Don't shoot!" the lead soldier called out, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "We're not here to fight. We need help." Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. The soldier who had spoken was a sergeant, probably in his 30s, with the weather-beaten face of a man who had spent years on frontier duty. But there was something in his eyes that Silas recognized, the look of a man who had seen something that challenged everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. "State your business," Silas called back, "and do it quick before my friends decide you're not worth the risk." The sergeant glanced nervously at the Apache warriors positioned around the clearing, clearly outnumbered and outgunned. "Sergeant Tom Mitchell, 3rd Cavalry," he said, dismounting slowly with his hands visible. "We've got wounded, and we're being hunted by our own men." It was the last thing Silas had expected to hear. "Explain that." Mitchell helped his wounded companion down from his horse, revealing a young private with a blood-soaked bandage around his arm. The third soldier, a corporal, by his stripes, kept watch on the tree line with the alertness of someone expecting trouble. "3 days ago, we were ordered to join Colonel Marwick's special patrol," Mitchell began, his words coming out in a rush of relief and desperation. "We thought it was a routine assignment, tracking some missing Apache women, standard search and rescue. But when we found their camp..." The sergeant's voice broke, and he had to stop to compose himself. When he continued, his words carried the weight of someone confessing a terrible sin. It wasn't rescue. It was hunting. Marwick wasn't looking for the women to help them. He was looking for them because they were witnesses to what his unit had done to their people. "We saw the camp they'd attacked, saw the bodies they'd left behind. Men, women, children, even the elderly." Silas felt his blood turn to ice. This was worse than he had imagined, far worse than simple assault or even the attempted kidnapping. Of the 9 women, if Mitchell was telling the truth, Marwick had escalated from brutality to outright massacre. "How many dead?" Nalnish asked, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of barely contained fury. 23 that we could count," the corporal answered, speaking for the first time. "Maybe more. They'd tried to burn the bodies, but the snow put out the fires before the job was finished." The Apache warriors around the clearing exchanged looks of grim understanding. This explained why the women had been willing to flee into a deadly storm rather than face capture. They hadn't just been running from assault. They had been running from men who would kill them to silence their testimony about mass murder. "When we objected," Mitchell continued, "when we said we couldn't be part of hunting down survivors of a massacre, Marwick accused us of insubordination, said we were either with him or against him, and men who were against him had a way of disappearing." "On patrol," the wounded private spoke up for the first time, his voice weak but determined. "We tried to slip away during the night watch, but they caught us. Started shooting. Jimmy here took a bullet trying to cover our retreat." Silas studied the 3 soldiers, reading the truth in their haggard faces and exhausted postures. These weren't hardened killers like Marwick's usual recruits. These were regular army men who had stumbled into a situation that violated everything they had sworn to uphold. "Why come here?" Silas asked. "How did you know about this place?" "We didn't," Mitchell admitted. "We were just running, following the same trail the Apache women must have used. When we saw the smoke from your chimney, we figured it was our only chance for help." From inside the cabin, Ayana emerged, taking in the scene with the sharp eyes of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. When she saw the soldiers, her expression hardened, but when she noticed the wounded man, something softer appeared in her features. The instinctive compassion of a healer confronted with suffering. She spoke rapidly to Nailnish in Apache, and Silas caught enough to understand that she was asking permission to tend to the wounded soldier. The war chief considered for a moment, then nodded gravely. "My grandmother will treat your wounded man," Nalnish told the soldiers. "But understand this, you are alive only because you chose to stand against the murderers you served with. That choice will be tested." As Ayana began examining the private's wound, Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made Silas's heart skip a beat. A leather dispatch case, official military issue, with documents visible inside. "We took this from Marwick's tent before we ran," the sergeant said, holding it out towards Silas. "We thought maybe if we could get it to the territorial authorities, they'd believe us about what he's been doing." Silas accepted the case with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were official documents, orders, and reports that painted a picture far more sinister than he had imagined. The papers revealed that Marwick's unit wasn't just a rogue operation. It was part of a larger conspiracy involving territorial officials and mining interests. The documents detailed a systematic plan to eliminate Apache presence from areas rich in mineral deposits. Attacks were to be staged to look like the work of hostile tribes fighting among themselves, clearing the land for development while giving the territorial government plausible deniability. Marwick's massacres weren't random acts of brutality. They were part of a calculated campaign of genocide disguised as frontier justice. "Sweet Jesus," Silas breathed, scanning page after page of evidence that implicated some of the most powerful men in the territory. "This goes all the way to the top. Governor Morrison, Territorial Secretary Williams, even Judge Hartwell." Nalnish moved to read over his shoulder, his English good enough to understand the implications of what they were. "Seeing, they plan to kill all of my people," he said quietly. "Every Apache in the territory, so they can claim our lands for their mines." But there was more. The documents revealed that other tribes were targeted as well. Ute, Cheyenne, even Navajo. Communities that had maintained peaceful relations with the territorial government for years. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its ambition and horrifying in its implications. "The 9 women who escaped," Silas said, understanding, dawning on him. They weren't just witnesses to a single attack. They were witnesses to the beginning of a planned extermination. Mitchell nodded grimly. "That's why Marwick is so desperate to find them. If they reach anyone who can understand what they've seen, if these documents become public, the whole conspiracy falls apart." The weight of the revelation settled over the clearing like a physical presence. They weren't just dealing with a rogue military unit anymore. They were facing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. A plot that threatened the lives of thousands of innocent people. Young Bear, who had been listening intently despite his limited English, spoke up in his own language. Nalnish translated his words with grim approval. "Young Bear says that now we understand why the spirits brought these women to us through the storm, not just to save 9 lives, but to save our entire people." Silas looked around the clearing at the faces watching him. Apache warriors who had accepted him as an ally, soldiers who had risked everything to do what was right, women who carried the truth about genocide in their memories. The responsibility he felt was overwhelming, but so was the clarity of purpose that came with it. "We can't just fight Marwick anymore," he said quietly. "We have to expose this whole conspiracy. We have to make sure these documents reach people who can act on them." "And how do we do that?" Nalnish asked. "When the very people who should protect justice are the ones planning murder?" It was a question that would require all their combined wisdom to answer, but for the first time since this crisis began, Silas felt something approaching hope. They had evidence now, proof that would be difficult for even corrupt officials to dismiss. The challenge would be staying alive long enough to use it. In the distance, the sound of many horses could be heard approaching through the forest. Colonel Marwick had finally arrived, bringing with him the full force of his murderous unit. But now the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined, and the battle they were about to fight would determine the fate of every indigenous person. In the Colorado Territory, The sound of approaching cavalry grew steadily louder, a drumbeat of hoofbeats that spoke of overwhelming force moving with military precision through the forest. From his position on the cabin's porch, Silas could see dust rising above the tree line, despite the snow, evidence that Marwick was bringing more men than anyone had anticipated. "Count them," Nalnish ordered quietly, and his warriors began, reporting numbers that made Silas's stomach tighten with dread. 40 riders from the south, called Bidzil, from his concealed position. 20 more from the east, reported another scout. "Western approach shows mounted units as well," came a third voice. Marwick had brought his entire force, plus additional men recruited from somewhere. Instead of the 20 soldiers Silas had expected, they were facing nearly 100 mounted, fighters armed with modern weapons and military training. The Apache warriors were skilled and brave, but they were outnumbered almost 2 to 1 by men who specialized in exactly this kind of warfare. Sergeant Mitchell, who had been helping Ayana, tend to his wounded companion, looked up with alarm. "He's called in favors," the soldier said grimly. "Those extra men, they're probably mercenaries from the mining camps, hired guns who won't ask questions as long as the pay is good." The 3 deserters had provided valuable intelligence about Marwick's current strength and disposition, but their presence also complicated the tactical situation. They were armed and experienced, but could they be trusted to fight against their former comrades? And what would happen to them if Marwick's forces achieved victory? Young Bear moved through the defensive positions like a man preparing for his own funeral, checking weapons and ammunition with the methodical care of someone who understood that death was not just possible, but probable. His earlier eagerness for battle had been replaced by the grim determination of a warrior who recognized impossible odds, but refused to back down. "We cannot win this fight," he said bluntly to Nalnish in English, making sure Silas could understand. "Not with direct combat. They have too many guns, too much training." It was a brutal assessment, but an honest one. In open battle, disciplined cavalry supported by experienced mercenaries would systematically destroy even the most skilled Apache fighters. The warriors' superior knowledge of the terrain would help, but not enough to overcome such overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. Silas studied the map one more time, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion: defeat and death for everyone in the clearing. But as his eyes traced the contours of the land around his cabin, an idea began to form, desperate and dangerous, but offering at least a slim chance of survival. "What if we don't fight them?" he said suddenly. The question drew puzzled looks from both Apache and soldiers alike. Nalnish raised an eyebrow with the expression of someone wondering if the mountain man had finally cracked under pressure. "Explain," the war chief said simply. Silas pointed to a notation on his map that marked an old mining tunnel about half a mile north of the cabin. "There's an abandoned silver mine up that ridge, dug about 10 years ago before the ore played. Out. The tunnel runs deep into the mountain, with several branches and at least 2 exits that I know of." "You want us to hide in a hole in the ground?" Young Bear asked with undisguised scorn. "I want us to disappear," Silas corrected. "Marwick is here for 2 things: the women who can testify against him and those documents that prove the conspiracy. If he can't find either one, if they simply vanish without a trace, he's got nothing to show for his efforts." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of preparing for a siege, they would stage an evacuation so complete that it would appear the cabin had been abandoned for days. The Apache warriors would escort the women and the crucial documents to safety through the mine tunnels, emerging miles away at locations where horses were already positioned for a rapid escape to tribal lands beyond territorial jurisdiction. But someone would have to stay behind to sell the deception, to make it appear that the cabin's occupants had fled days ago rather than minutes before Marwick's arrival. Someone would have to remain to face the colonel's fury when he discovered that his prey had slipped through his fingers. "I'll stay," Silas said, before anyone else could volunteer. "It's my cabin, my responsibility, and I'm the one Marwick will want to question personally." The protests came immediately and from all sides. Nalnish argued that it was suicide for one man to face 100 enemies. Ayana insisted that his knowledge of the territory made him too valuable to sacrifice. Even Sergeant Mitchell pointed out that Marwick would torture him for information before killing him. But Silas had made his decision with the calm certainty of a man who had found his purpose at last. "Someone has to buy you time to get clear," he said firmly. "Someone has to keep Marwick busy while you disappear into country where he can't. Follow. And someone has to make sure those documents reach people who can act on them." Young Bear stepped forward, his face set with determination. "Then I stay with you. 2 men can hold a position longer than one. And I as well," Bidzil added. "My fighting days are numbered anyway. Better to end them in a cause worth dying for." Before long, half the war party was volunteering to remain behind for what amounted to a suicide mission. It was both touching and tactically unsound. Too many defenders would make it obvious that the evacuation was a ruse, while too few would be overwhelmed before they could accomplish their mission. Nalnish settled the matter with the quiet authority of a leader who had made difficult decisions many times before. 4 will stay, Grizzly McGraw because it is his place, Young Bear because his courage demands it, Bidzil because his wisdom is needed, and myself because I will not ask my warriors to face death while I flee to safety. The choice of defenders was both practical and symbolic. Silas brought intimate knowledge of the terrain and cabin. Young Bear provided the fierce fighting spirit that could hold impossible positions through sheer determination. Bidzil offered the tactical expertise of a veteran warrior who understood how to make every shot count. And Nalnish carried the moral authority that would ensure their sacrifice had meaning for future generations. As the evacuation began, Silas found himself working alongside people who had become more than allies. They had become family. Ayana pressed a small leather pouch into his hands, explaining in her limited English that it contained herbs that would help with pain and infection if he was wounded. Hastian taught him a few words in Apache that he said would be useful if any warriors survived to tell the story of this day. The women gathered their few possessions with the efficient movements of people who had learned to travel light and fast. But before leaving, each of them approached Silas to offer thanks in their own language, their eyes conveying gratitude that needed no translation. These were people who understood the value of sacrifice, who knew what it meant for someone to choose their welfare over his own safety. Sergeant Mitchell and his men faced their own terrible choice: stay and fight their former comrades, or flee with the Apache and become permanent fugitives from military justice. In the end, they chose to stay, motivated by a combination of duty, guilt, and the simple human need to make amends for the evil they had witnessed. "We took an oath to protect the innocent," Mitchell explained as he checked his rifle. "Doesn't matter if the people we're protecting from happen to be wearing the same uniform we are." As the evacuation party prepared to depart through the concealed trail that led to the mine entrance, Silas took a moment to study his cabin one last time. This had been his sanctuary for 15 years, the place where he had found peace after the trauma of military service and personal loss. Now it would become his fortress, and probably his tomb. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had fled civilization to avoid the moral compromises of frontier life was about to make the ultimate moral choice, sacrificing everything to protect people he had known for less than 3 days. But as he watched the women and children disappearing into the forest, he felt no regret, only a deep sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since his youth. Nalnish was the last to leave, pausing at the tree line to look back at the 4 men who would hold the cabin against impossible odds. The war chief raised his hand in a gesture that was part salute, part blessing, and part farewell. Then he was gone, melting into the forest with the silent grace of his people. The clearing fell quiet, except for the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant but growing sound of approaching cavalry. Silas, young Bear, Bidzeel, and the three soldiers took their positions with the calm efficiency of men who had accepted death but refused to make it easy for their enemies. "How long do we need to hold them?" young Bear asked, testing the action of his rifle. "Long enough," Silas replied, though he honestly wasn't sure what that meant. "Long enough for the evacuation party to reach safety. Long enough for the documents to reach honest authorities. Long enough for the story of this day to survive and inspire others to stand against injustice." Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the simple act of standing was enough, regardless of how long they lasted. Maybe courage was measured not in minutes or hours, but in the willingness to face overwhelming odds for the sake of something greater than oneself. In the distance, the sound of many horses had stopped. Colonel Marcus Marwick had arrived, and he was probably surveying the cabin through field glasses, planning his approach with the methodical care of an experienced predator. Soon, very soon, the final confrontation would begin. But for now, there was only the peace of morning sunlight on fresh snow, the comfort of good men standing together, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, when the test came, they had chosen honor over safety, justice over survival, and the welfare of others over their own lives. The attack came with the cold precision of a military operation, but also with the cruelty of men who enjoyed inflicting pain. Colonel Marcus Marwick rode into the clearing at the head of his assembled force, his scarred face carrying the same expression of predatory satisfaction that Silas remembered from their brief service together years ago. Marwick had changed little. In the intervening time, still tall and lean, still carrying himself with the arrogant bearing of a man who believed his rank gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. But there was something new in his eyes, a darkness that spoke of years spent indulging appetites that civilized men kept carefully controlled. "Silas McGraw," Marwick called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered clearing. "I know you're in there, you traitorous bastard. Come out and face the consequences of your interference." From his position behind the reinforced window shutters, Silas could see the deployment of enemy forces with the tactical eye of his former profession. Marwick had positioned his men expertly, with mounted units covering all possible escape routes, and dismounted soldiers preparing to advance on the cabin under covering fire. The colonel had also brought something that made Silas's blood run cold. A small cannon, probably taken from a frontier fort, that could reduce his log walls to splinters. "You've got 5 minutes to surrender the Apache fugitives and return." "Stolen military property," Marwick continued, his tone suggesting he was enjoying this moment of apparent triumph. "After that, we'll come in and take what we want, and you'll wish you'd been more cooperative." Young Bear, positioned at the cabin's rear window, spoke quietly in Apache to Bidzeel. Silas caught enough words to understand that the young warrior was asking for permission to begin the fight immediately, to take some of the enemy with them before the overwhelming assault began. But Bidzeel shook his head with the patience of experience. "Let them reveal their intentions," he said in English, for everyone's benefit. "Make them show what kind of men they truly are." Marwick's patience lasted exactly 5 minutes, timed by the pocket watch he consulted with theatrical precision. When no response came from the cabin, his expression shifted from confident superiority to cold fury. "Very well," he called out. "We'll do this the hard way. Corporal Davies, prepare the gun." The soldiers began positioning the small cannon for a direct assault on the cabin's front wall. At this range, even a single shot would create a breach large enough for a coordinated infantry assault. Silas and his companions would be overwhelmed within minutes of the bombardment beginning. It was time to spring their trap. Silas had spent his 5 minutes of grace not in prayer or preparation, but in making final adjustments to a surprise he had prepared during the long night. The cabin's cellar, originally dug for cold storage, had been modified with carefully placed charges of black powder taken from his mining supplies. When detonated, the explosion would bring down most of the structure while creating enough confusion to cover his real strategy. "Fire in the hole," he whispered, and touched a match to the fuse he had run up through the cabin's floor. The explosion was enormous, far larger than Marwick could have expected from a simple log cabin. Flames and debris erupted skyward as the building collapsed in on itself, creating a mushroom of smoke and destruction that temporarily obscured the entire clearing. But the 4 defenders weren't in the cabin when it exploded. They had used the confusion of the bombardment preparation to slip out through the carefully camouflaged tunnel that connected the cabin's cellar to a concealed position among the rocks 50 yards away. Now they occupied a fortified position that Bidzil had prepared during the night, with excellent fields of fire and natural protection from return fire. Marwick's men reacted to the explosion with the confusion of soldiers who had expected an easy victory, and instead found themselves facing an opponent who was better prepared than they had imagined. Several horses reared and bolted, carrying their riders out of the immediate fight. Others dismounted and took cover, unsure whether the explosion was the prelude to a larger attack. "There!" young Bear called out, pointing to a cluster of soldiers who were trying to organize a flanking movement. His rifle spoke once, and a mercenary spun around and fell, clutching his shoulder. The battle was joined with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Silas found himself firing his father's old cavalry saber at men who wore the same uniform he had once worn with pride, and each shot felt like a small betrayal of everything he had once believed about duty and loyalty. But these weren't the honorable soldiers he had served alongside in his youth. These were predators who had turned their military training into tools for murder and exploitation. When he saw one of them raising his rifle to shoot at young Bear's exposed position, Silas didn't hesitate to put a bullet through the man's chest. Sergeant Mitchell and his companions fought with the desperate intensity of men trying to redeem themselves for past complicity in evil. Their knowledge of military tactics proved invaluable as they anticipated and countered Marwick's attempts to coordinate his superior numbers into an effective assault. The colonel himself remained mounted and mostly out of range, directing his men's movements with the cool professionalism of an experienced officer. But Silas could see frustration growing in Marwick's posture as his overwhelming advantage in numbers failed to produce the quick victory he had expected. "Burn them out!" Marwick shouted, his voice carrying the edge of a man whose careful plans were unraveling. "Use the fire arrows!" The order revealed the depths of Marwick's desperation and cruelty. Fire arrows in winter conditions, with snow covering everything, would be largely ineffective against stone and earth fortifications. But they would create smoke and confusion, and they showed that the colonel was willing to risk starting a forest fire that could spread for miles just to flush out 4 determined defenders. As flaming arrows began to arc through the air, Silas realized that their position, while defensible, was not sustainable. They had bought precious time for the evacuation party, but now they needed an exit strategy of their own if any of them were going to survive to tell this story. The battle reached its crescendo when Marwick finally lost patience with tactical maneuvering and ordered a direct assault on the defender's position. What followed was 15 minutes of violence so intense that it seemed to compress time itself, turning moments into eternities and eternities into heartbeats. Silas found himself face to face with his past in the most literal sense when Colonel Marwick finally dismounted and led the charge personally, his saber drawn and his scarred face twisted with fury. The 2 men met in combat among the rocks where Silas had made his stand, and the clash of steel on steel rang out over the sound of gunfire like bells tolling for the dead. "You always were too soft, McGraw," Marwick snarled as their blades locked together, too concerned with the feelings of savages to do what needed to be done. "And you were always too eager to mistake cruelty for strength," Silas replied, pushing back with all his remaining strength. "Too willing to hide your cowardice behind orders and regulations." The duel was brutal and personal, 15 years of moral disagreement distilled into a few minutes of lethal combat. Marwick was younger and faster, but Silas had the advantage of fighting for something he believed in rather than something he feared to lose. When the colonel's blade finally found its mark, sliding between Silas's ribs with the wet sound of steel parting flesh, the mountain man's response was to grab the blade with his bare hand and drive his own saber through Marwick's heart. Dana died together, locked in their final embrace, the corrupt officer and the man who had chosen redemption over safety. But their deaths were not meaningless. They bought the final minutes that young Bear and Bidzil needed to complete their own escape through the mountain paths that only they knew how to navigate. As the echoes of gunfire faded and the smoke began to clear, the survivors found themselves in a transformed world. Sergeant Mitchell and his men had fought with honor and emerged victorious, but at a cost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Nearly half of Marwick's force lay dead or wounded in the snow, while the colonel himself would never again threaten innocent people with his perverted sense of duty. The documents that proved the conspiracy had been safely evacuated with Nalnish, and his people carried to tribal councils that would know how to use them effectively. Within weeks, the evidence would reach military authorities in Washington who retained enough integrity to act on clear proof of genocide and corruption. But the real victory was not measured in casualties or captured documents. It was measured in the fact that 9 Apache women who should have died in a storm or worse had lived to tell their story. It was measured in the alliances formed between people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. It was measured in the simple truth that when evil shows its face clearly, there are still those willing to stand against it, regardless of the cost. As young Bear and Bidzil made their way through the mountain passes toward safety, they carried with them something more valuable than military secrets or strategic intelligence. They carried the memory of a white mountain man who had chosen to die rather than let innocent people suffer, and an Apache war chief who had trusted his people's lives to a stranger's honor. The snow began to fall again as the battle's survivors dispersed to their various fates. Some would face courts-martial for their roles in Marwick's conspiracy. Others would find new lives in places where their past couldn't follow them. But all would remember the morning when right and wrong had been as clear as the mountain air, and when ordinary people had found the courage to do extraordinary things. In years to come, the story would be told around both Apache fires and frontier settlements, growing in the telling, but never losing its essential truth, that honor is not a matter of uniform or skin color, but of choices made when everything hangs in the balance. Children would learn about the mountain man who opened his door to strangers in a storm, and the warriors who trusted him enough to fight beside him when death seemed certain. The cabin was gone, reduced to ashes and memories, but the clearing remained. And in the spring, when the snow melted, wildflowers would grow where good men had bled for justice. The mountain itself would endure, as it always had, keeping watch over the high country where Silas McGraw had found his peace and lost his life in service to something greater than himself. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Colorado Territory, Nalnish would tell his grandchildren about the white man called Grizzly, who had proven that courage could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for the simple right of innocent people to live without fear. The storm had brought strangers together and forged them into something stronger than the sum of their parts. When it passed, the world was changed, not through the grand gestures of powerful men, but through the quiet heroism of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph without a fight. 6 months after the battle at Grizzly McGraw's cabin, the high meadows of the Colorado Territory bloomed with a profusion of wildflowers that seemed to celebrate the return of peace to the mountain country. Where Silas's cabin had once stood, a new structure was taking shape, larger than the original, built not for one man's solitude, but for the meetings between peoples who had learned to see past old hatreds. Nalnish stood on the porch of the new building, now officially designated as a neutral meeting ground between the Apache nation and the territorial government. In his weathered hands, he held a carved wooden door that had survived the cabin's destruction, its surface scarred by bullets and blackened by smoke, but still solid, still functional. It would be installed as the entrance to the new council hall, a symbol of the open door that Silas McGraw had offered to strangers in their darkest hour. The territorial government had undergone a transformation that few could have predicted 6 months earlier. Governor Morrison and his co-conspirators were facing federal charges for their role in the planned genocide, their conspiracy exposed by the documents that Ayanna and the other Apache women had carried to safety. A new administration, led by men who understood that peace was more profitable than war, had implemented policies that recognized indigenous rights to ancestral lands while establishing frameworks for coexistence and mutual benefit. The change hadn't come easily. There had been resistance from mining interests and settlers who preferred the old ways of taking what they wanted by force, but the evidence of systematic murder had been too overwhelming to ignore, and the federal government's response had been swift and decisive. Military units had been disbanded, territorial officials had been replaced, and new treaties had been negotiated that actually meant something. Young Bear, now wearing the eagle feather that War Chief Nalnish had bestowed upon him during the battle, served as one of the Apache representatives to the new territorial council. His hot temper had been tempered by the wisdom gained through combat and loss, and he had become a powerful advocate for his people's rights, while maintaining respect for those white settlers who dealt honestly with indigenous communities. "He would have liked this," Young Bear said in English, gesturing toward the construction activity around them. "The mountain man. He would have liked seeing enemies become neighbors." Nalnish nodded, his own English much improved through months of diplomatic negotiations. Grizzly McGraw understood something that took the rest of us too long to learn, that survival depends not on destroying your enemies, but on discovering that they don't have to be enemies at all. The Apache women who had survived that terrible night in the storm had all found ways to contribute to the new peace. Ayanna had become something of a legend, traveling between settlements to share her knowledge of healing and her wisdom about conflict resolution. Her story of the mountain man, who had risked everything to protect strangers, had helped convince many skeptical whites that indigenous people were fully human, deserving of the same dignity and respect they expected for themselves. The 3 soldiers, who had deserted Marek's unit and fought alongside the Defenders, had faced military tribunals, but their testimony about the conspiracy had been so crucial to the prosecution's case that they received pardons rather than prison sentences. Sergeant Mitchell had left the army and established a trading post near the new council hall, building a business based on fair dealing between cultures rather than exploitation of one by another. But perhaps the most significant change was less visible and more profound, the growing understanding among both peoples that their survival depended on each other. Apache knowledge of the land proved invaluable to settlers trying to farm in difficult conditions. White technological innovations, when shared rather than imposed, improved life for indigenous communities. Children from both cultures played together, learned each other's languages, and grew up seeing cooperation as normal rather than remarkable. The new council hall was more than just a building. It was a symbol of possibility, proof that people who had been taught to hate each other could choose a different path. The structure incorporated both Apache and frontier architectural traditions, with log walls providing strength and security, while traditional ceremonial spaces honored the spiritual practices that grounded both communities in their connection to the land. As the sun set behind the peaks that had witnessed so much violence and sacrifice, delegations from both communities gathered for the hall's dedication ceremony. The ritual was unlike anything that had been seen before in the territory, a blending of Apache spiritual practices with frontier traditions, creating something new that honored both without diminishing either. Hastian, now serving as one of the Apache elders on the territorial council, spoke in his quiet voice about the lessons learned through tragedy and conflict. The spirits brought strangers together in a storm, he said, his words translated for those who needed them. They tested us with violence and hatred, and some of us failed that test. But enough of us passed to make this day possible. When the ceremony concluded and the various delegations had returned to their homes, Nalnish remained alone on the porch of the new hall. In the gathering darkness, he could see lights beginning to appear in windows throughout the valley. Apache cooking, fires and kerosene lamps in settler cabins, evidence of communities that were learning to coexist rather than merely survive each other. From his pocket, he withdrew something he had carried for 6 months, a small wooden bear, carved by Silas McGraw during the long winter evenings in his destroyed cabin. It had been found in the ruins after the battle, scorched but intact, a testament to both the craftsmanship and the philosophy of the man who had made it. The carving represented more than artistic skill. It embodied Silas's belief that strength could be gentle, that power could be used to protect rather than dominate, that even the most fearsome creatures could choose peace over violence when the situation allowed it. In many ways, the wooden bear had become a symbol of the new relationship between peoples who had once considered each other irredeemable enemies. As he prepared to return to his own camp, Nalnish hung the carved bear from a peg beside the new hall's entrance. Tomorrow, children from both communities would see it there and ask about its significance. Their parents would tell them the story of the mountain man who had opened his door to strangers in a storm and about the warriors who had learned that courage was not about destroying enemies, but about protecting the innocent. The story would grow in the telling, as such stories always do, but its essential truth would remain unchanged. That honor transcends the artificial boundaries that divide people, that justice is worth dying for, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. The wooden bear would keep watch over the hall for many years to come, a reminder that the wild country had been tamed not by violence, but by the simple recognition that all people, regardless of their origins, deserve the chance to live with dignity and hope. And in the high mountains where Silas McGraw had found his final peace, the wildflowers would bloom each spring in memory of a man who had proven that the door to understanding need never be closed, even in the wildest storms.